Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas on how to lead your church into the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Now, here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. This is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm welcoming you to another episode hosted by Martha Tartarnic, featuring guest Justin Anthony. Justin is Rector of Chingford Parish and was until recently the Deputy Director of the Anglican Centre in Rome. He has worked in Alexandria, Virginia as Dean of Students at a theological college, Canterbury as Rector of a parish in the city, Oxford as precentor of Christ Church Cathedral, and Cirencester as curate and team vicar in the parish. He was born in Singapore and educated there, in Germany, North Yorkshire, the London School of Economics, and Oxford. He has written 3 books as a sole author and contributed to others on issues of church life, ministry, and culture.
Welcome to the Future Christian Podcast. I'm your guest host today, Martha Tartarnic. And today we have a cross-Atlantic conversation with the Reverend Dr. Justin Anthony. Welcome to the show, Justin.
Thank you, Martha.
It's exciting to have this time to talk with you across the pond.
Thank you.
That's great. Okay, can you just give us a little rundown about yourself? Share a little bit about who you are.
I'm the rarest creature that you could possibly imagine. I am a Singaporean Welsh Yorkshireman who has lived in Singapore, Germany, Canada, the United States, and Italy. A big chunk of that time I've been involved in church life in the Anglican Communion. So I was baptized in St. George's, Tanglin in Singapore. My parents were there the last days of the Empire. And lived in Germany, surrounded by the British Army. Didn't live in England until I was 12. But that doesn't stop me from being a proud Yorkshireman. When it comes to cricket, and a proud Welshman when it comes to rugby. These are the important things.
These are the important things to note about you. Okay, That sounds pretty good. What do you think it has meant to be a Christian in the past, and how might that be different from what it means to be a Christian today?
Well, my first degree and my first love was history. My father was a high school history teacher. So I have always taken a historical point of view. My attitude is that at seminary, I think that we ought to teach people church history before we teach them biblical studies, because when we give them people skills in history, then will overcome this sort of all the doubts about the historical veracity of the Gospels. My point of view about what it means to be a Christian in the past is exactly the same as being a Christian today. Terry Eagleton, who is an interesting character, he's a literary critic, an atheist and a Marxist, but heavily influenced by a teacher of his when he was a young man who was a Dominican friar. Eagleton said that the Christian gospel invites us to contemplate the reality of human existence in the body of an executed political criminal. And he derives that from Herbert McCabe, the Dominican's aphorism that if you don't love, you're dead, and if you do love, they'll kill you. And that's always been true for being a Christian in the past. And it's especially true of being a Christian now. We, in the West, in England, in Canada, in the United States, live in a society of enormous comfort. Relative to history and relative to our brother and sister Christians today. The number of Christians who've been martyred for their faith in the 20th and the 21st century outnumbers the combined total of Christians who were martyred for their faith in the first 19 centuries.
Oh my gosh.
When I worked in Rome, I was part of a every year there was a service of commemoration of the Christian martyrs of the previous year alone, organized by the Sant'Egidio community. And we would gather into a basilica and we would listen to the names of those who had been killed for their faith in the previous year. And they numbered in the hundreds. So I think that's it. You know, the challenge for those of us who are living in the comfortable and complacent West is to realize that being a Christian is, or ought to be, a dangerous thing.
I mean, that is quite a startling frame on the numbers. And you're right. Like, we just really have no idea in the West. I think that we take the ability to practice our faith in peace completely for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is quite remarkable.
We think that being disrespected is the equivalent of being martyred.
Yeah, like not being able to put up our nativity scene at City Hall, that is similar, and it's not.
Or
right?
Rowan Atkinson. I mean, I just read a review now of the new Willy Wonka film, and Rowan Atkinson has a role in it, playing yet another bumbling clergyman. You know, so, oh my goodness, we are being persecuted because Rowan Atkinson is mocking us. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No, we need to get some perspective. I mean, certainly, my background is in music history. That was my undergrad. And I feel like that served me incredibly well in terms of then going to seminary after, because music history in the West and the church history are so completely entwined.
Yeah.
Maybe I can just like reframe that question then a little bit. Like, have you noticed a shift in terms of what it means to lead a church over the course of, the years that you've been in?
Yeah. So
in pastoral ministry,
as well as being Singaporean Yorkshire Welsh, I am another rare creature in another way, in that I have been ordained 31 years in the Church of England, and I'm still only in my 50s, just still in my 50s. In the late 80s and early 90s, it was incredibly rare for people to be ordained in their 20s, because the culture of the church was go away and get some experience of the real world. So,
same with us, for sure.
So even now, it was my birthday yesterday, even now, I'm only 3 years older than the median age of people who are being ordained. And so, what I see over the course of that is, I'm going to dispute the premise of your question, is the fact that we can now ask the question about what it means to lead a church. That becomes the verb that we want to use more and more and more often. And I've seen that being introduced as just the basic understanding, the basic expectation of what it means to be a priest. Let alone what it means to be a pastor, what it means to be a minister. Everything in the ordinal of the Church of England just collapses down into this idea of leadership. And that's problematic because, first of all, we don't know what leadership means. And secondly, the culture that we operate in that uses the word leadership gets its meaning of the word leadership from all kinds of extremely dangerous places, so much so that I would say that leadership is actually a heretical idea. To go back, so I've disputed the premise of your question, sorry. But to go back to it.
You're also kind of giving away the whole podcast.
Yeah. Well, no, I'm teasing people.
Just hold some of those thoughts.
But to go back to how it's different is that I think one of the expectations for clergy within the Church of England now is that we function as cultural and social facilitators. It's a sort of distortion of the idea of being an enabler, and somehow being an enabler became the de rigueur word of the early part of my ministry, is that we enable people, and we're here to facilitate the priesthood of all believers. We saw a good example of that in COVID, that when the government regulations were lifted, and the government guidelines were lifted, and the Church of England's regulations and the Church of England's guidelines were lifted, all four sources of restriction, not necessarily coordinating. But when they were lifted, the Church of England sent out guidelines saying, okay, so you don't actually have to observe social distancing anymore, and you are allowed to have communion, you are allowed to have public worship. But what you have to do is you have to take account of people's feelings about how they might coming back. And I was extremely reluctant to take account of people's feelings, because people's feelings are inchoate and incoherent and inaccessible to anybody else. When somebody says, I feel this, there's no argument. You can't argue with people's feelings as well. But one of the changes over the last 30 years is that more and more and more we are expected to facilitate people's greatest flourishing whilst not actually not actually having people who are able to articulate what it is that they need to flourish as well. So it's been this cultural. Did you ever? I don't know if your listeners have ever seen the old British sitcom from the 70s called Are You Being Served? It's probably shown on PBS Masterworks or something like that.
Yeah, so, I mean, I feel like I have seen glimpses.
Okay,
of it,
it's set in an old-fashioned department store, Grace Brothers, and all the staff are having hijinks every week. And at the end of each episode, young Mr. Grace, who is about 90 years old, staggers onto the set and tells everybody, "You're all doing very well." And everybody goes, "Thank you, Mr. Grace." And that's the only time we see him. And I very often get the impression that what we're expecting of our clergy now is to function like young Mr. Grace, to come on at the end, irrelevantly tell everybody that they're all doing very well. And then
I'm okay, you're okay, we're all okay, isn't this okay?
Aren't you marvelous? You're absolutely marvelous and perfect in every single possible way. And more the expectation is for us to function in that way.
Yeah, okay. So we're going to dig into this whole concept about leadership and how much that has become the dominant language about talking about pastoral ministry. Just before we dig into that, is there a spiritual practice that is particularly meaningful for you these days?
Yeah, say your bloody prayers. The real advantage of being a priest of the Church of England, a sentence I never thought I would say again, is that we have a canonical obligation to say morning and evening prayer every day. Right. We actually have to do that. That's one of the controversies about the Church's reaction to COVID, was forbidding us from going into church to say the daily office, our canonical duty. And the sheer regularity of saying your prayers, words that have been written down by other people 3,500 years ago sometimes, and making them, not making them your own, but making yourself theirs, is the only thing that keeps me going and sustains me. It's really boring. It's nothing shiny and sparkly. It's not one weird tip that you get on some internet things, but it's actually, the sheer regularity of saying the daily office along with countless other Christians throughout the world.
Well, I will tell you, we ask all of our guests this question, and we interview guests from all different denominations. I would say that answer comes up with surprising frequency across different denominations, that practice of the daily office is centering and meaningful.
Yeah.
And you're sharing that from a tradition where, as you say, it's mandated. But it's amazing how many people do find their grounding there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's reassuring.
Yeah. It's a definite gift of the Church of England for sure. Okay, so today we are predominantly talking about your latest book, You Are the Messiah, and I Should Know Why Leadership is a Myth and Probably a Heresy. So if that doesn't pack a punch, I don't know what does. You definitely, there's some clickbait in that title, Justin, for sure.
Absolutely.
So your book is, as you've hinted at, it's based on a very carefully constructed, but I would say also counterintuitive argument, which is that although we talk about leadership a lot, not just in the church, but in general, it's actually very poorly defined what it is that we're really talking about. Is leadership something defined by what a person does, by who they are? Is it something that you learn? Is it something that you're born with? Although we use the language a lot, there's very little clarity about any of that. Mm-hmm. Now, I do have to say, this is a podcast that is pretty explicitly meant to equip church leadership.
Cool.
So your book is
here I am in the heart
relevant.
of darkness.
Yeah, here you are in the heart of darkness. This is a pretty relevant topic, and it's also a challenging topic. So what do you see as being the problem with how we talk about leadership in general?
Okay.
Not specifically in the church, generally.
Okay. In general, we don't know what it is. We don't know why it is. We think it's a good thing. Simple as that. So I got into this because you say my latest book. It's more than 10 years old now, and it came out as a result of my PhD. So my the weird thing was that I was writing the final manuscript for the book and had to submit that before I had actually been examined on the PhD, doing the two things at the same time. I was taking footnotes out of the book and putting jokes in, and taking jokes out of the PhD and putting footnotes in. And it grew out of the previous book that I'd written, which again had a clickbaity title, If You Meet George Herbert on the Road, Kill Him, which was a sort of an attempt to try and analyze what the problems were with the roots of a return to the roots of English parochial ministry.
Yeah, that's real clickbait for Anglicans.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are loads of people who have refused to read that book just because of the title alone.
I know.
So, great. More fool them. One of the things that came out from that was thinking, what we need to do is that clergy need to regain a confidence in their ministry and in their calling. And at that time, I thought it was leadership. Then I realized, with a capital F, and then I realized
So you thought that was the answer?
I thought that was the answer. Yeah. We needed to be, okay, we need this thing called leadership. What is this thing called leadership? And then roughly about that time, a RAF reconnaissance plane crashed in Afghanistan and killed all 14 crew on board. And there was a review of what happened, an accident investigation. And the conclusion of the accident investigation was that the plane crashed because of a lack of leadership. It was over and over again in all the inquiry that they made was that they said that all warning signs and trends about the maintenance of the aircraft weren't handled properly, and we need to improve leadership. And I thought, hang on, don't we need to improve maintenance and engineering and the way the plane is flown rather than leadership? But no, leadership was the solution first. So I began to think about, okay, so how is leadership used? It's the universal solution. And once you start looking out for it, you find that there isn't a sphere of human endeavor. We're not talking about the church now. Every human endeavor in which leadership is the solution for it. So, in economics or in politics or in international relations or in sport, you get it all the time in sport. He showed real leadership. And I even found that there was a catering conference that was held in Scottsdale, Arizona in 2010, which was the Catering Leadership Conference. So you have to be a leader in catering now. So I thought, okay, I want to find out more about this. And I came across a guy called Keith Grint, who teaches management at a technical university in the UK. And he said that in December 2000, between October and December 2008, which is the time I was beginning to think about this, there were 3,000 references to leadership or its lack in the British press alone. So in just 3 months, 3,000 mentions of it as well. So then I came across a guy called Andrew Dubrin, who had written a book on leadership, research findings, practice, and skills. And this sounded like the thing that I was wanting from the Kill George book. And the third edition, which came out in year 2000, in his preface, he said, there are 35,000 different definitions of leadership. I have no idea how he counted them.
35,000.
That was the year 2000. In 2010, when the 6th edition came out, he had given up counting, and he had said, a Google search of articles and books about leadership in organizations indicates 188 million articles. In all those entries, leadership is probably defined in many different ways. Okay, so Andrew Dubrin, who makes a living out of selling the idea of leadership and the practice of it, isn't able to define it. Ralph Stockdill, who wrote something called a Handbook of Leadership, says there are almost as many different definitions of leadership as there are persons who have attempted to define the concept. So this was beginning to irritate me. So I thought, I need some focus for this. So I'll start a PhD. And I was very fortunate. I found a supervisor who was a theologian, but was a cultural theologian, and was able to sort of integrate me into the business school of the local university. So I was able to do this work with the business school. So I went through the business literature. And, here are some definitions of leadership. The process, the act of influencing the activities of an organized group in its efforts towards goal setting and goal achievement. Or the behavior of an individual when he is directing the activities of a group towards a shared goal. Or the accomplishment of a goal through the direction of human assistance. A leader is one who successfully marshals his human collaborators to achieve particular ends. Or the process of influence between a leader and those who are followers. Or the art of mobilizing others who want to struggle for shared aspirations. And then I came across two much more realistic definitions. One from Rowan Williams, Archbishop of Canterbury then, people wanting to be told they're right. And I thought, that's a good definition of leadership. And then Heifetz and Linsky wrote this brilliant book for, I think it's for Harvard, which said, leadership is disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. And I thought, okay, I like that. That's realistic. So Stockdill, after doing this survey of what leadership is, he said, 4 decades of research on leadership have produced a bewildering mass of findings. It's difficult to know what, if anything, has been convincingly demonstrated by replicated research. The endless accumulation of empirical data has not produced an integrated understanding of leadership. But still, it's a good thing. And the reason why it's a good thing is we can sell leadership courses to anxious people who feel that this is the thing that's going to give them the edge over their business competitors. Everybody needs it. Have you got it? Let me sell it to you. And not only
that's a pretty cynical conclusion. We don't know what it is, but it's good to sell it.
We don't know what it is, but we're going to sell it to you. And it will make all the difference to your business. Because, we live in a cutthroat capitalist environment. I mean, 75% of companies that are on the London Stock Exchange, the top list, that won't exist in 25 years' time. So, if you want your company to exist, you're going to have an edge. And the edge is now, we've been told, is leadership. So there's no agreed definition of leadership. But again, further on from that, in a meta way, there's no agreed typology of all the different definitions of leadership. So people will say, there's this family of leadership definitions and there's this family of leadership, and nobody agrees on that either, because it is just so nebulous.
Right.
So, when I was thinking about this, I was thinking, okay, so if the church is saying what we need is leadership, what exactly is it that the church is saying? Is it something that's inherent? Is it something that is a skill that can be learned? Is it a technique that can be applied? Is it something that is to do with the individual? Is it something that manifests itself in a group of people? It changes all the time. It used to be that leadership was something that was inherent in the individual until, get this, the Second World War. when all of a sudden you needed to train a lot of ordinary men, usually men, to be officers in the military. So then you needed ordinary people who perhaps inherently weren't great leaders to actually exercise leadership skills. So then leadership could be something that could be taught.
Right.
But then it keeps on changing. It keeps on changing. So in the end, I decided that the only way to understand leadership is to say that leadership is pornography. Or rather, leadership is like pornography. So Justice Stewart, who was on the American Supreme Court, very famously had an obscenity case come before the Supreme Court. And in order to define whether something was obscene, you had to define whether it was pornography. And he said, pornography, you know it when you see it.
Right. Okay. That's how leadership is.
That's how leadership is like pornography. But also, leadership sells glossy magazines. And pornography does the same thing as well. Leadership is like pornography. You know it when you see it. The advantage of leadership is that it is sexier and more glamorous than the real boring, humdrum requirements of management. So leadership is management on steroids. We, in the 20th century, we have developed CIOs, complex industrial organizations, which is what the management gurus talk about it. And complex industrial organizations require an awful lot of managing different resources. If you've got 25,000 people who are working for you, you're going to have some degree of skill to be able to set out what everybody's going to do. And management is the requirement of that. But the problem is that management has become extremely unglamorous. It's not heroic at all. Mm-hmm. So to begin with, we had managerial leadership, which was basically the allocation of resources and the management of scarcity. And that happened over the most of the 20th century. And
are we talking about the church, or
we're not talking about the church at all yet. This is because what happens is the church is Johnny come lately when it comes to this thing. So this is in complex industrial organizations. So you have Taylor, who was the guy who did efficiency studies. And then you had Tom Peters, who talked about how you do excellence. And the management morphed itself into managerialism, which is an ideology that there is no endeavor within human society that cannot be improved by applying the principles of management. So this is why you have managers, people who have got MBAs, who come in to manage hospitals, who come in to manage schools, who come in to manage the army. So Michael Heseltine, who was a cabinet minister under Margaret Thatcher, he said that efficient management is the key to revival. If Britain's managers fail, we can turn out the lights. And this idea that managers have the right to manage, and management is a universal, politically and morally neutral skill. Now, Alistair MacIntyre, the philosopher, cut the ground out from underneath that idea 45 years ago. And he said that the moral neutrality of management and managerialism is one of the central moral fictions of our age, that it really doesn't apply. When Mussolini made the trains run on time, and he didn't, that's a myth. But when Mussolini made the trains run on time, that wasn't a morally neutral action. It required a degree of coercion. MacIntyre said, this is a great thing, is that the whole concept of effectiveness is inseparable from a mode of human existence in which the contrivance of means is in central part the manipulation of human beings into compliant patterns of behavior. And it is by appeal to his own effectiveness that the manager claims authority within the manipulative mode. And if you want to know what that looks like, he uses the analogy of a priest 500 years ago praying for rain, and when it happens to rain, claiming the credit for it. as well. Okay. So that's managerial leadership. But it's not very glamorous. And then in the 70s and the 80s, there began to develop another form of leadership, which is basically what I christened mythological leadership. And the best example of that, and this is where we get into the church, because finally the church begins to catch up, is that we had a report that was written when George Carey was Archbishop of Canterbury about restructuring the central organization of the Church of England, the central institutions. And it was written by, the committee was chaired by the Bishop of Rochester, a chap by the name of Michael Turnbull. And he said in his preface to the report, question never far from the mind of a church leader is, how can I break out of institutional shackles and be the true, adventurous, uninhibited leader that I want to be? Which, when I read that, made me think of Aragorn and in The Return of the King, leading, doing his famous speech about, there will become a day of wolves and broken swords, but it is not this day. Men of the West, this day we fight. And this kind of sort of, here I am on my charger with my sword, leaping into the unknown and into adventurousness. And the Church of England, under George Carey in the 1990s, and then increasingly with Michael Turnbull and Turnbull's report, thought itself that the only way that we were going to face the challenges of modernity and secularism was to imitate the way in which complex industrial organizations had previously organized themselves through management and managerialism. But they bought into not just plain old straightforward Taylorism or excellency or anything else like that, but this idea that you could be a mythological character. You could be the true adventurous hero that you're required to be. So this is where you end up with what I call Jesus MBA. Jesus's problem was that he didn't have an MBA. And Rowan Williams, who sort of presided over this, as Archbishop of Canterbury, like King Canute, unable to keep the waves from coming in, he recognized the drawbacks of it. He said, the leadership thing is one of the problems here. He said this in 2009. I've sometimes said when people say we want you to give a lead, what they mean is we want you to tell them, not us. We don't want to be led. So within the church, leadership is something that happens to other people. Okay. You see this, the way that leadership in schools in the UK had become something. I was a parish priest in which we had a Church of England school. The marvelous things about having the established church is that, that state schools are affiliated to the established church. And their mission statement was to create leaders. And I thought, what, all 1,200 of them? Yeah. If we've got 1,200 leaders, who can be the followers? Because nobody is ever actually saying, what we're going to do is that we're going to create followers. But leaders require followers. Otherwise, you end up with the pastiche, the satire of the life of Brian, where you have the People's Front of Judea, who consists of one single solitary person. Mm-hmm. And that's where the title of You Are the Messiah comes from, is a line from the life of Brian. You are the Messiah, and I should know, after all, I've followed a few. The life of Brian nailed this political incoherence about it. So up to that point, I was thinking, okay, we don't know what leadership is, but we do think it is the universal panacea. It's hard to see how managerial leadership applies to the church, because the church isn't a complex industrial organization. It's an institution. It's something that's relational. And, if your listeners want to find out some more about this, a really good person to read is a priest in Episcopal priest in the Diocese of Colorado called Lyndon Shakespeare, who's written a brilliant book about being the body of Christ in a time of management.
Okay.
He talks about the difference between being an organization and being an institution, and why being an institution is a really important thing. So, but we don't know how these techniques actually work within the church. But I was slightly concerned about the language that was being used for this, true adventurous leader. And that's when I began to think about, well, where are the ideas coming from for this kind of language? And it was the Aragorn Men of the West speech that made me think, hang on a second, that sounds like a description of a movie character.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk about that a little bit, and then I want to kind of circle back to why this is a problem.
Okay.
Specifically in the life of the church. But yeah, let's talk. I mean, you can tell from your book, I think, that you're a bit of a movie buff, and that you have a pretty good handle on Hollywood and the stories that have come out of Hollywood over the last couple of decades. So where do you see that influence from Hollywood on this idea of mythological leadership and also like in Christian leadership?
So American movies are the universal hermeneutic for understanding our experience in the world today. Period. And if you doubt me, just look at the next time that there's a news report of something horrific that's happened, a hurricane, or a fire, or an explosion, or, as was reported in the British press today, 2 reindeer broke out from a Christmas winter park and were running down a major highway. Everybody will always say it was just like a movie. So we make sense of our experiences by relating it back to what we have seen. And the dominant cultural expression of movies is American, and has been since about 1930. So we recognize reality in as much as it is reflected in and formed by American films. So then you have to think about, okay, what's the American culture that's going on here? And there are 2 academics called Lawrence and Jewett who wrote this brilliant book about the American monomyth, which, as they call it, which is the myth of redemptive violence. Right. That there is no problem that cannot be solved by somebody coming in and exercising judicious violence to eliminate the problem. I mean, my chaplain at university advised me, he said, when you get into parish ministry, don't worry, there's no problem in the parish ministry that can't be solved by a good funeral. But what Lawrence and Jewett are saying is that you don't have to wait for the person to die, you can do it yourself. And once you see that as a structure, it happens over and over and over again in films, that you have a stranger who comes from outside to a community that is facing an existential threat. The community are unable to rescue themselves from that existential threat. So the stranger who comes from outside, and there is an air of mystery about him, is reluctant to get involved with the life of the community as well, because then he wouldn't be the stranger from the outside. But eventually, when a threat happens that is acute enough, usually a little child is hurt, then the stranger will unleash all the violent skills that he has and will rescue the community by killing all the bad guys, which is basically the plot of Shane. But it's also the plot of Grosse Pointe Blank. And, the number of times that if you watch an American film from the 50s onwards, even today, is what will happen is that violence will solve the problem. The best ever Christmas movie ever made, Die Hard. What's involved in that? It's Bruce Willis getting a bloody singlet. Ultimate violence. And so Lawrence and Jewett, their analysis is, the foundational myth of America is the individual exercising violence for good of society. And that ties in with a culture within American business. There's a what's it called? There's a particular fashion in American business management. It came out in the 1990s, called business process re-engineering, which sounds like a really, really boring name. But all the people who advocated BPR, because you always have to turn it into a 3-letter acronym in order to be able to trademark it and sell it. But everybody who advocated BPR advocated violence as part of their business process. So, we shoot dissenters. People need the back of a hand. Board meetings are conducted by machine gun. And, you look at even TV series today, look at Succession. It is all part of this underlying myth of violence. The problem is that, if exercising leadership like Shane is about the implicit use of violence, what the hell has that got to do with Jesus Christ?
Yeah. So, where do we see this coming into church ministry?
So what happens is that you will have people who will have their vision and who will not brook dissent. So that within the polity of the Church of England is that bishops will have a vision for how the diocese should go. Everybody has to have a missional strapline. They're usually 3 gerunds, learning, living, loving, going deeper, going harder for Jesus, all this kind of stuff. Lord save us from bishops who've got a graphic design budget. But what that means is repudiating what has happened before. This is part of business process re-engineering. Every situation is year 0. You can't learn from what has happened before. You have to impose it, and that there is no dissent. Now, so I was doing this research in 2008. It became a PhD. It was presented for examination in 2012. This is over 10 years old. Nobody in the Church of England was interested in it at all. But there's a new book out by Alison Milbank, The Once and Future Parish.
I did want to talk about that. Yeah.
And it is the first book in which I have been quoted approvingly for this work. So I think she's great. But what Alison Milbank is doing is in analysing the way in which the polity of the Church of England has been changed in the last 10 years to circumvent the independence of individual ecclesial communities in England, parishes, for the greater good of a vision and a strategy, capital V, capital S, that has been imposed from above by people who are coming in from the outside. And she goes through in certain dioceses where there is no dissent is brooked and people are excluded from it. Now, I went to the book launch for this, and Alison Milbank was introduced by I was going to say he's a famous priest, but famous for the Church of England, which is a given definition of fame, a chap by the name of Giles Fraser.
Yes, Giles Fraser.
Yeah, you've heard of him.
Yep. His articles get circulated a lot.
So I take Giles really seriously because he was the year below me at theological college. So but Giles was saying, he doesn't understand why people collaborate with dioceses when diocesan administrations send out the latest watch of required managerial administrative returns, predicated upon the model that diocese is head office and the parishes are the local franchise businesses. And he said, I don't do that at all. I don't cooperate. And I pointed out to him, but if you don't do that, then the support of the diocese is turned off. You don't get the curates. You don't get new staff. You don't get the financial support. And more and more money that had been passed the endowment of the Church of England for the running of the parishes is being separated out for specific projects that dioceses and parishes can bid for. So we have the strategic, I keep on thinking it's the Strategic Defence Fund, but it's not that. It's SDF, and I don't know what it means, which is being replaced by something else called SMIBD, which is basically, we have decided this is the kind of thing that we're going to fund. Dioceses have to bid for it, which then, once you do that, you introduce this whole layer of managerialism, because you have to have people who are writing bid proposals and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
And if you don't subscribe to the shibboleth of leadership, if you aren't going to put yourself in the heroic role that Michael Turnbull described 15 years ago, then you're not going to get that support. I used to think, along with John Keble, that if the Church of England ceased to exist tomorrow, it would continue in my parish. I am uncertain now whether the resources of the parish have been allowed to remain intact enough for that to happen.
Yeah.
And that's my problem about it.
Yeah. Okay. So I just want to pick up on a few threads that you've said here and ask a few follow-up questions. So first of all, I just want to say that I hear reports from different denominations across North America and certainly across the Anglican Church of Canada of that same kind of dynamic that you're identifying, that there's a tighter and tighter control over the narrative. Dissenting voices get their heads chopped off and put on the city walls as a warning to trespassers.
Sometimes metaphorically, usually literally.
Yeah. Hopefully not too literally, but so I think like the dynamic that you're identifying is by no means just a Church of England dynamic. And, I think leaders across the Western Church are sort of wrestling with this increasing centralization of denominational structures and where do we go for honest, critical conversation. I'm hearing sort of a few problems with this leadership model as we use it right now. So I hear you name the incoherence of using language that we don't really understand. I hear you naming kind of that violence of controlling who gets to speak and what they get to say. I'm curious as to whether you also identify a violence that gets done to the leaders themselves in sort of trying to be this mythological figure and this savior of a declining church. Like, where does that part of the violence kind of fit in?
I mean, the interesting thing is that I don't think that there are any moustache-twirling villains in the Church of England. I don't think there are any. I don't think anybody in the Church of England in any position of power or responsibility wakes up and thinks, "What evil can I wreak upon the Church today?" I mean, occasionally Alison Milbank, her rhetoric is, which I'm happy to cheer. I think sort of exceeds the evidence when she starts talking about things being satanic.
I think that's a really fair disclaimer. I appreciate you saying that.
But I think what happens is that it's a function of fearfulness.
I agree.
And that people have been put into a position of great change without any real grounding in the history of the church. And they feel that they are responsible solely for not just saving the church, but fixing it. So, Stanley Hauerwas talks about how Christians today are functionally, they don't believe in the Holy Spirit. I think the challenge within the Church of England is that our bishops are functionally atheist. That's not true. Functionally Marxist. in that they believe that if you can get the economic relationships right, then everything else will fall into place. And that if we just get the sort of, the transactional relationships sorted out, then we will be gathered into the New Elysium and, sunlit uplands and everything else like that, which has very, very little for God to do. So about 10 years ago, there was an announcement of a huge new program in which we were going to increase the number of vocations to the ministry. And we were going to have 10,000 new vocations a year. And I looked at it, I thought, where's the Holy Spirit functioning in that? What we're going to do is that we're going to set the Holy Spirit a quota and see what the Holy Spirit comes up with.
Yeah, so, just put in your takeout order for the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. Do you do Uber delivery? And I think the terrible thing about that is that you get people who are desperate to get themselves into positions of power, positions of influence, and they want to get their hands on the levers of power. And when they get there, they realize that those levers of power aren't actually connected to anything. I mean, there was a very good description of Gordon Brown, who was the Prime Minister after Tony Blair, the last Labour Prime Minister, who had been Chancellor of the Exchequer for many, many years and wanted to be Prime Minister. And when he got to be Prime Minister, everything fell apart. We had the major financial crisis. And there was this rather compassionate but damning description of him being in 10 Downing Street with his hands on the levers of power and then not being connected to anything. And I think that the problem is that because the church has lost confidence in it herself as an institution to raise up its own ministers, the individual people who are raised up as overseers within that don't have the confidence in the ability of the church to do that, which is why we're constantly looking to outside structures. So rather than having a prayerful person as the Archbishop of Canterbury, let's have an oil executive as the Archbishop of Canterbury. Rather than having somebody who has been formed entirely within the Church of England, let's have the chief nurse for the National Health Service as the Bishop of London. And over again, you'll see people who are now bishops within the Church of England who have had long and distinguished careers outside of the church, because we don't have the confidence that the church can actually form its own leaders as well.
Well, and that probably is very much connected to the question that we're asking about what the church needs to be, which is it needs to survive, right? Like that's question around survival becomes like sort of central, which is a very fear-based question. And I think that's right. I think that because the survival feels like it's compromised or in question, then we sort of abandon the markers of the trade, so to speak, and look outside.
If you think
what's going to help us survive.
If you think that the major responsibility of the church is to survive, you will do everything that you can to make it survive, and by doing so, you will kill it. The responsibility of the church is not to survive. The responsibility of the church is to be the body of Christ in this world. And that might involve us actually dying. Now, speaking as a priest of the Church of England, it's quite hard to imagine that because we've been worshipping God with a faint air of superiority since 597. But it might well be that the function of the Church of England, is to die in this time and place. Movie analogy. You ever seen the film Contact with Jodie Foster and Matthew McConaughey?
Yeah, I did see that.
It's about building we receive instructions from aliens about how to build a machine that can travel through time and space. And Jodie gets to be the first astronaut to go in it. And she notices that the astronaut's capsule contains a chair in which he is going to be strapped in, which wasn't in the aliens' instructions. And NASA say, well, we don't know what you're going to go through, so we want you to be safe. So she goes down these wormholes, and it's the most excruciating experience. And she is being shaken almost to death by this. And she can't hold on to this any longer, until she realizes that the crucifix that Matthew McConaughey had given her as a gift, because he was the fighting young pastor who made a difference, was floating from round her neck and was completely still in the space of the capsule. So she undoes her safety harness, and she finds herself that she is no longer being shaken. It was the chair that was to keep her safe that was killing her. And quite often, I think that in the church, we try and decide what it is that we have to do in order to keep the church as a human institution going, rather than thinking, what is it that God is doing and that we have to get out of the way of? So, the effect upon the leaders is, as long as they think it's their responsibility to keep the church alive, then everything that they do is actually going to end up harming the church.
Well, and I have to say, I have just a ton of compassion for how easy it is to get caught up in that Messiah complex, how easy it is to think that the responsibility lies solely on our shoulders, whether it's because of our own ego or because it's how we're influenced by this cultural mythology or what have you, or whether it's just because, we love the church that we have and we want to see it keep going and, and our own sort of desire gets caught up in our fear and our sense of this all rests on me to fix it or save it. So I have lots of compassion for that, but I do think we also have to really push back against it and be clear about who we are and where we find our center. So just one more question before we go to our final rapid fire questions. But if you were, going to offer one antidote to this kind of obsession around mythological or even managerial leadership, what do you think we need to come back to?
I think we need to come back to Christ. Just come back to Jesus. But that's the standard response. Every time a vicar asks a question in church, the answer is Jesus. Because the answer is always Jesus. But if you want to see an example of how that works out in the complexities of the 20th century, then look at the life and witness of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Because Bonhoeffer, Alison Milbank doesn't give him a good time because she thinks that Bonhoeffer was responsible for religionless Christianity, which I don't think that I don't think Bonhoeffer was for that. But you look at Bonhoeffer, the idea of the heroic leader was right there at the heart of German culture from the mid-19th century onwards. Interesting side question. Why don't they have leadership studies in Germany? Because do you know what the German word for leader is?
Führer.
There you go. It's really hard to have leadership studies when the model of leadership is the Führer.
Oh my gosh.
Hitler wasn't the first Führer. There were people who were constantly looking for the Führer. The English look for King Arthur. And Bonhoeffer would have been the perfect candidate for it. I mean, he was tall, he was good looking, he was blonde, he was charismatic, he was musical, he played Bach like Bach, he was a fantastic tennis player, he was really good company, and he was morally scrupulous. And he refused to take on the role that that he could have easily taken on. To go back to the Lord of the Rings metaphor, he refused to take the One Ring. He was basically Faramir and not Boromir. And that led him to Tegel prison, and that led him to execution in Flossenburg. So, Bonhoeffer's way of refusing to be a leader whilst remaining faithful to being a disciple of Christ. That's a really good example. And the way that we do that, this is the story I always really like, is that when Bonhoeffer was invited by the Confessing Church to set up his illegal seminary in Finkenwalde, he thought, I better find out how we're going to run this seminary. Seminarians need to learn to worship. So he came back to England, where he had been a minister in a German language Lutheran church. And he did a tour of the Anglican theological colleges to find out what forms of worship they used. And he decided that the best form of worship for seminarians in the face of Nazi oppression was evensong. Book of Common Prayer, 1662, evensong. Immerse people in the scriptures, immerse people in the story of God's work amongst his people in the world. And so, the seminarians of Finkenvelde had Bonhoeffer's adaptation of BCP evensong. In other words, go back to what I was saying right at the beginning, is say your bloody prayers. Allow yourself to be changed by God, so then that you can be part of what God is doing and changing the world around outside. And it's not going to involve snazzy graphic designs. It's not going to involve wonderful new initiatives. It's just going to be this, the good old religion, as Nicholas Ferrer described it, is the idea of a rule of life and living as a rule of life and being able to be recognized as somebody who lives under a rule of life. It's really unglamorous.
Well, and what I love about that evensong example, and then your words about the office at the beginning of our podcast, is it's not just prayer, it's collective prayer.
Yeah.
It's prayer with the body of Christ.
Common prayer.
I think that is such an antidote to the sense of having the whole thing resting on our shoulders alone. So, yeah, thank you. We are going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll have our closing rapid fire questions. Welcome back to our Future Christian podcast conversation. Today, we're going to wrap up with some closing questions. These are pretty rapid fire, Justin, and we always tell people that they can take them as seriously or not as they want. Okay?
Right.
So, Justin, if you were Pope for a day, what would that day look like? What would be top of the agenda?
I'd resign.
That's no fun.
No. If I had been made Pope, it would be a serious error of judgment of the people of God and perhaps the Holy Spirit as well. I think probably the safest thing for all concerned, especially my immortal soul, would be to resign. I recognize my propensity to love. I had a mentor who his last job in the Church of England was to train clergy for cathedral ministry. And he said the one thing that he wanted to get over to them was, just because you work in a big and important building doesn't mean you're a big and important person.
Right.
And he said that he was never, ever able to get that message over to people. And I recognize the propensity that I have of being tempted to thinking that I'm big and important. So if I was going to be Pope, I'd resign, because they only hope for it.
Okay. So the Holy Spirit got it wrong. And you're putting in your notice.
Absolutely.
Okay. We haven't had that answer before, so thank you.
Oh, good. Well, that shows how special I am.
Very special. Yeah. Big and important and special.
Yeah.
What theologian or historical Christian figure would you want to meet or bring back to life, or, have supper with?
Oh, Bede.
Bede?
Definitely Bede. Definitely Bede. I mean, Bede, who life and the things that he saw right from being a child, and the imaginative universe that he had, because everybody thinks of Bede as just being the person who wrote the history of the English people, and his biblical commentaries and his scientific work, and the fact that he was doing it in Monk Wearmouth and Jarrow, so far away from anywhere important as well, and the fact that he's the father of English history. So I definitely want to meet with Bede.
Okay. What will history remember from our current time and place?
history will look back at the early part of the 21st century and think, how could they be both so sentimental and so superstitious at the same time? I think people will recognize us as being, sentimentally superstitious. Hashtag be kind. I think, that sums that up as well. I think that, the rise of sort of moral policing that is tied up with under a pretense of being just lovely and soft and fluffy to everybody is going to be something. I think we're going to be lumped in with the 1860s and that kind of Victorianness as well. I think we'll be seen as being sentimentally superstitious.
Sentimentally superstitious. Okay, good.
Yeah.
What are your hopes for the future of Christianity? I feel like you've touched on this already, but anything else you want to articulate about that?
Yeah, the Book of Revelation. The Book of Revelation. Evening prayer in the Church of England at the moment for Advent is we're working our way through Book of Revelation. And last night we had the whole of Revelation 19. As the second reading at evensong, and it was all about killing the beast and the birds of mid-heaven coming down and feasting on the flesh of kings and of princes and of captains and of death and gore and everything else like that. And right at the end of it, it was just me and my colleague there, and I said, all those in favour of this being an accurate record of our PCC meeting, say aye. Just that kind of cool. But when you set that aside and you look at the end of Revelation and New Jerusalem coming down as a bride adorned for her husband. And my chaplain at university said that, Christianity has a holy book which begins in a garden and ends in a city.
I know. It wasn't all a mistake. It
wasn't all a mistake. So the hope of Christianity is that, we've been through worse. It might be hard to believe that, but we've been through worse and we're still here. And the faithful remnant is still the faithful remnant. And the hope of Christianity is the bride adorned for her husband.
Yeah, I have to say, just as an aside, my favorite Bible studies that I've had the opportunity to be part of have been on the Book of Revelation. I mean, just such riches.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, where can people find more about you?
Why would they want to?
Because you gave such a brilliant podcast interview.
Oh, okay. Oh, well, thank you.
They're going to be clamoring to find you.
Yeah, well, I don't do social media anymore. I gave up blogging a long time ago. I've got 3 books. If people want to read those, there's a book on a painting by Hieronymus Bosch called Circle of Thorns. Works really, really well as a Lent book. There's the book on Kill George. If you meet George Herbert on the road, kill him, which is about Anglican ministry. And then there's You Are the Messiah. And I'm available for weddings, bar mitzvahs, and funerals. So, if you want me to come and talk to a clergy conference, I'm more than happy to do that.
Okay.
My new project, I'm working on a new project about, the latest thing to irritate me is the difference between the misunderstood difference between heroes and saints. And within the Church of England and the Episcopal Church is that we think that saints ought to be heroes, and we don't understand the difference between them. We don't know what saints are or who they're for. So I'm working on that, and that might end up being a book. And if it does, it's going to have a clickbait title. You can guarantee that.
All right. Yeah. Look for clickbait, but you're hard to find online.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't exist online. Yeah.
That sounds good. Well, thank you so much, Justin. We always leave people with a word of peace. So the peace of God be with you, Justin.
And also with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. One more thing before you go. Do us a favor and subscribe to the podcast. And if you're feeling especially generous, leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people about the podcast. The Future Christian Podcast is a production of Torn Curtain Arts and Resonate Media. Our episodes were mixed by Danny Burton, and the production support is provided by Paul Romick-Levitt. Thanks, and go in peace.